approach to inspire transformative action, to empower and connect, to create equitable and climate resilient communities. We believe in the power of our daily actions to reconnect people to self, our community, and place, which ultimately heals our society and planet. Our holistic approach really starts in the soil and swells into culture and policy change. And we implement a 3 interwoven strategy as an approach to create a rippling effect of systems change. First, we begin this through spreading solutions and models that offer tools and skills and resources so that other people can grow their own food or medicine and habitat and community while preserving the resources and fighting climate change. And that can take and look like a lot what we're doing today by joining together to collaborate and share ideas. It's really important that we're able to connect to one another and ultimately our land. The next approach that we like to do here at Daily Acts is to strengthen community leadership. We are partnering with different organizations and networks to outreach to our community and create strong, resilient alliances and civil empowerment. We modeled this approach through our Leadership Institute program for just and resilient communities, our youth-led program, Eco to School, and empower personal ecology through our environmental health network. Lastly, as an organization, we're working to build public and policy political change through mobilizing our community's power for environmental and climate policies. We're really excited to get started today and dive into healthy soil. We just want to go over a few housekeeping guidelines. Please feel free to optimize and use the chat box. This is a little program that you can use to message one another. Just make sure that you have it set to everyone so that everybody in the chat can see what you share. If you do have a question at any point during the webinar, you can ask it in the Q&A box. We typically save these till the end of the presentation, but if you have any questions that arise that feel particularly relevant in the moment, I'm happy to let Connor know during the presentation. It's really important that you ask your question in the Q&A box, because if you ask it in the chat, it might get lost with certain communications going on there. And we'd love for you to stay for the whole duration of today's webinar, but if by any means, if you have to leave, don't worry, we'll be sending you a follow-up email with some really great resources and a link to the recording. And so yeah, I'll take it to Connor today. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you, Corey. Thank you to all of you for joining us this evening. And big thank you to the City of Petaluma for making this program possible. We're really excited to be connecting with the Petaluma community about such an important topic. So, growing healthy soil. This is a really rich topic. There's a lot that can be said. It's being discussed more than ever, as far as I can tell. But the thing is, a lot of these conversations about soil are really detail heavy. They're oftentimes tailored to farmers, to biologists, or chemists. You know, we're mostly looking at residential landscapes, not exclusively, but more so than looking to like maximize yields or profits. We're talking about an ecosystems perspective. And while it would be fun to look at soil through a microscope, we're not really going to be zeroing in on the biochemical minutia. We at Daily Acts are not soil scientists. I'm not expecting that there are any soil scientists in the audience tonight, but if there are, if that's you, feel free to drop some wisdom in the chat. The takeaways, we're going for high level. So we're going to talk about what soil is, what makes healthy soil, how it relates to water and to climate, and how it relates to plants. So just to get things started, kind of a fun little activity. If you feel comfortable, go ahead and close or lower your eyes. And I want you to picture healthy soil. Maybe taking some deep breaths while you're thinking about, what does healthy soil look like? How does it smell? How does it feel? And we'd love to hear some of your thoughts, some of that imagery, some of those descriptive words that come up for you in the chat. And maybe as those come in, Corey can read some of those out to us. No wrong answers. Don't be shy.
Smells earthy. Healthy soils damp with a rich earthy smell. Like after the rain, it's like a dark rich color. It's really awesome summer. Love the imagery.
Give it just another minute here, see if we have any other thoughts.
Loose, fragrant, not gooey.
Definitely a fair amount of gluey soil in Petaluma, that adobe clay, huh?
There's life in healthy soil, little friends like worms. Definitely. Dark, damp, filled with roots and fungi and wormies. Annette has said that they've been told that the bacteria that we smell gives dirt its distinctive smell.
That's definitely true of that after rain smell as well, which is one of my favorite words. It's petrichor, the smell after rain. Okay, that's awesome. Thank you all for participating. And then I want to do the same thing, but with unhealthy soil. It can look like a lot of different things. So, maybe an experience you've had with unhealthy soil. What did that look, smell, and feel like?
Awesome, Judy, thank you for sharing what you want to learn. Karen says that unhealthy smell smells stinky and pungent. Donna says trashy, gluey pieces where there's soils in it. Terry says light, no connectivity, breaks apart, it's dry.
That's where my mind goes as well, but these are all good answers.
Crumbly and dry, pale in color. That's what I think too, Summer.
Yeah, so I can tell we've got some good intuition in this group. So let's talk a little bit about what soil actually is, what it's made of. I think when I first learned this, I was pretty surprised to find out that soil is, half of it is oxygen and water, 25% oxygen, 25% water. Let me just get my little laser pointer here. And we've got 45% of it is mineral content, which is what I think, at least this was true for me, and I think for a lot of people, is what we think about when we think of soil. We think about the mineral content. And then there's this sliver here that is 5% organic matter, and that number can change, but we're going to be talking a lot about that one today. We're going to talk about all of them, but let's start out with the mineral content. So there's a lot of attention focused on this part of soil composition for understanding how water moves through the soil. And in Petaluma, as those of you who are local likely know, there's a lot of clay soil in Petaluma and in Santa Rosa. I know that there's some sandy soil on the west side of Petaluma as well, some pockets, and I'm sure it varies throughout the region there, but Um, it's important to know that the type of soil we have, maybe you've seen the like soil pyramid or triangle before that shows different combinations of sandy clay or sandy loam. That is not something that we change. If you have a clay dominant soil, you have a clay dominant soil. You can't remove the clay from soil or remove the sand. That mixture is just what's endemic to place. But that doesn't mean that we can't change the soil structure and the soil health through stewardship practices that focus on primarily the organic matter content, and then as well as the air and the oxygen that are in the soil. So the organic matter in soil, we're talking about organisms, which we'll go into detail on in a minute, 10% roots, and 80% humus, which is the what is created by the decomposition of leaves and other plant matter by the organisms in soil. This is really our best avenue to focus on for transforming an unhealthy, what were some of those words, crumbly or lacking connectivity, I think I saw soggy, these kinds of soils into spongier, healthy soils. You know, we can transform a degraded soil into a healthy soil by balancing these 4 different areas, but by really focusing on that organic matter component. So one way to visualize the difference between healthy soil and a degraded soil is to think about a dry sponge and a moist sponge. So maybe like a sponge that's been wrung out and then left in the cabinet under your sink for a couple months versus a sponge that you just used to do dishes an hour ago. If you run each of those under the faucet in your sink, you're going to see that the moist sponge retains a lot more water than the sponge that is bone dry. And this is kind of counterintuitive for a lot of people, and especially in our context of drought. When we talk about, you know, in a drought, we'll get the rain and it's just going to absorb all the water, the soil will. And that's really not the case. Soil behaves much like a sponge does, in that when it is dry and desiccated, it sheds water, water runs off. Whereas when it's spongy, it has the capacity to absorb and retain water. So there's a really fun experiment that I learned from Dee Pursehouse, who is very knowledgeable about soil and about water, how it moves through landscapes, how it moves through plants and soils. If you just take a slice of bread, like store-bought sandwich bread, like white bread, and maybe a cup or 2 of flour, and you put each on a plate that has a rim, you pour water onto the piece of bread. And this works best if you can kind of mimic the rain, like using a watering can. You'll notice that the water kind of spreads out throughout that piece of bread. Eventually it's going to hit a saturation point, and there will be a little bit of runoff extra around the plate, depending on how much you pour, but significantly less than when you do the same to this kind of mountain of flour that you've built. When you pour water on the flour, you're going to see it run off. It's going to erode the pile, and it's going to cause flooding, which causes further erosion. You might be starting to connect some dots between this and what happens on our landscape, these cycles of flooding, erosion, and drought. We're going to talk a little bit about a little bit more in a moment. So the key here is healthy soil functions, all soil functions like a sponge. When it's healthy and it's moist, it retains water that plants can use. It's a buffer against flooding. It holds it through the dry season. It'll keep your plants healthier longer. Whereas degraded soil will sheet water off, it'll run off. So this is a photo that I took in Sebastopol I guess the Sunday before last when we had the really significant storm. I would imagine some of you have similar or even more dramatic photos, considering much of the county, including Petaluma, saw record rainfall. And so we might think, oh, the drought is over. And if you didn't already know, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but the drought is not over. And I hope by the end of this webinar, you'll have a good sense of why that might be and how that relates to soil. So on this rainy Sunday, once the wind died down and it felt a little safer, I spent the whole afternoon just with my rain boots on, walking around town in Sebastopol and in Forestville, watching how water is moving through the landscapes, rushed away into creeks, eventually into the Russian River and the Pacific Ocean, taking all manner of like trash and surely all kinds of chemicals, things that we don't want in our riparian or waterway ecosystems along with it. And this, if anyone, I know we had one person from Sebastopol, this is Libby Park here. So usually this little duck pond doesn't even come up to the bottom of this fence. And as you can see, it's almost swallowed this bench here. I'm sorry, it doesn't go to the fence, and it's almost swallowed this bench here. The next day, it was pretty much back to normal. And that happened at a really broad scale. And it's not so much that the soil was drinking in the water, which is what we want, though surely that was happening in places. To a large extent, what we saw happen was water rushed off the landscape, right? It's channeled off of our personal landscapes into storm drains, into creeks, where it's rushing through at a really high rate of flow, eroding soil as it goes and ending up in the ocean. So this is a graph showing the flow of the Russian River at a point in Healdsburg, so well below the reservoirs or downstream from the reservoirs. Just at the peak of the storm, you can see we went from virtually no flow at all to this really significant spike. And then within, less than 48 hours, it was back on this downward trajectory. And unfortunately, I don't have the continued graph, but we can kind of presume it's continued dropping down. That's a lot of water. That we went from 0 cubic feet per second up to almost, it's probably about 18,000, and then back down to 3,000 within such a small amount of time. And now that water's in the ocean where it's not really benefiting anybody. Marine species aren't going to notice much of a difference there either. So I could go on and on about drought and flooding, but instead I'm going to enlist the help of Charles Eisenstein, who is a bit more concise than I am, to talk about the water climate nexus. So we have just a brief video, and Corey, if you could take over the screen share and get us started on that, that'd be great.
When we think about climate change, we tend to think about carbon dioxide in the atmosphere warming the planet. Carbon is so central to our thinking about the climate that many other important aspects are excluded from the conversation. One of these things is water. Water is actually the dominant greenhouse gas, but its global effects are difficult to measure because it doesn't spread out evenly in the atmosphere like carbon does. Its effect on temperature also depends on the many forms it takes. When it takes the form of a haze, it has a warming effect. When it takes the form of clouds, it has a cooling effect, except for at night, in which it has a subtle warming effect. Since atmospheric water is hard to model, it tends to get ignored. But temperature is not the only important aspect of the climate here. If the climate can be warm or cold, the climate can also be wet or dry. The rampant rise of floods and droughts of our time are said to be caused by climate change, but really they are climate change. While temperature does have some effect on rainfall, floods and droughts are primarily caused by disruptions to the hydrological cycle. We tend to think of the water cycle this way. Rain falls, water evaporates, condenses into clouds, and repeats. But this is only part of the picture, since a lot more happens underground. Healthy soil is like a sponge that soaks up a lot of water. Some of it is taken up and stored by plants, and some of it percolates deep down into aquifers. This groundwater wells up and feeds springs and streams, which allows even more life to thrive. There's then much more water to evaporate from the saturated ground or to transpire through plants. This abundance of water vapor allows for more consistent rainfall. So what happens if we cut down the forest, plow the grasslands, and expose the soil? Without trees or plants to buffer the rain, the heavy downpour compacts the soil. The water can't soak down into the compacted ground, so almost all of it stays above ground and we have a flood. Almost all this water runs off, carrying loads of topsoil with it. And when the rain stops, the little water there is left evaporates very quickly, leaving the ground compact and dry. This lack of percolation depletes the groundwater over time, so it can't feed the streams, which dry up. Now there's no water in the land to feed rain clouds, and we have a drought. If a rainstorm does come, it just creates another flood and worsens the subsequent drought. Instead of consistent rainfall, we have a flood-drought cycle. Fortunately, it is possible to reverse this trend. There are ways to regenerate ecosystems and restore the water cycle pretty rapidly, while feeding people in the process. Making subtle changes to the land's topography can slow the flow of water, allowing more of it to soak into the ground and be used by plants. Plants with deep roots help break up the compacted soil, allowing water to percolate deeper. Everyone has a place in reversing the climate crisis. Whether you're working to protect healthy ecosystems, regenerate damaged ones, or just helping yourself or your neighbor depend a little less on industrial agriculture, you are helping the earth heal.
All right, thank you, Corey. And I see a message from Annette in the chat. Thank you for that reframe. It's true, there's no benefit. And I'm not trying to suggest, I'm sorry if I implied otherwise, that it's not good to have water in the Russian River. What I would like to see is water moving more slowly across the landscape and entering that river system in a more controlled way to raise the flow more gradually. And of course, it's good to have the bar breached so that the salmon can spawn. So thank you for clarifying that. Exactly, slow it, sink it, spread it. So I will go ahead and share it again. All right, so one of the key takeaways in this brief but very informative video is that soil has a huge role in the water cycle and the carbon cycle. You know, and I also want to clarify that the implication of this video is not that carbon is not important to our changing climate. It's arguing that water is also very important. Much of the conversation looks at how climate change affects water, and this video is expressing that we should also be paying attention to how water and how we have altered the flow of water in the water cycle is also impacting the climate. So we know that healthy soils are important for many reasons, including having more regulated precipitation and kind of busting our cycle of recurring drought. How do we get there? So for every 1% increase in soil organic matter, an acre of land can store an estimated 20,000 gallons of additional water. If you're like me, trying to picture 20,000 gallons is not a super meaningful reference point. So this is about 2 average sized swimming pools worth of water, or 4 of those big, oftentimes green, like 5,000 gallon tanks that you might see around rural parts of Sonoma County. Or it's about 285 bathtubs. Regardless, it's a lot of water that could be kept in place. It could be boosting the health of plants. It could be restoring aquifers. It could be not causing flooding and erosion. If we are increasing the soil organic matter content of our soil, we can be tending it so that it's a reservoir for water, replenishes groundwater, and whoops, sorry about that. And again, it's supporting healthy plant life that adds beauty and habitat to our community, to our ecosystems. So I'm going to say this or things like it a lot. We want well-hydrated, spongy soils that store more water. So we want to focus on cultivating organic matter. So when I showed you that pie chart earlier, we had the 10% organisms that makeup of organic matter in the soil. What are those? We talked about worms a little bit, but there's also, and someone else mentioned bacteria, but there's a whole ecosystem that is thriving in the soil. Like, soil is not a thing per se, it's a community of life. So this is a diagram of the soil food web, which has been made known by soil scientist Dr. Elaine Ingham. A fact that I love to share is that in a teaspoon of healthy soil, there are more living things than there are humans on Earth. So in a healthy soil, like you all described in the beginning, that's sort of that rich, like 70% dark chocolate color, it's hydrated, it's moist, it's spongy. We've got organic matter like leaf litter, but then we also have little single cell organisms like bacteria, we've got fungi, nematodes, we have bigger insects, arthropods, earthworms that are sort of the next rung up in the food chain. And between all these organisms, we have an ongoing exchange of energy, nutrients, minerals. So when we're cultivating the organic matter, we're helping support a complex ecosystem. And it's almost more helpful for me to think about when we're gardening or we're farming or landscaping, we're not really growing plants. We are fostering an environment for the soil, and it's the soil that really grows the plants by making the nutrients and the water that plants need available to them. So real quick, I have one more short video just to show you a bit of what it looks like, what's actually going on in the soil. So Corey, if you want to take over the screen share one more time. So on the right, we have like a terrarium with some soil and organic matter with soil fauna. So even though it's moving fast, you can see some earthworms and some other creatures. On the left, which doesn't have these soil fauna, these living organisms, it doesn't look like much is happening. You know, you could see like a little bit of mold, yeah, and maybe some fungal growth in there, but things aren't really breaking down. So when we have these organisms present and we're creating an environment that is conducive for them to thrive, you can see that breakdown of organic matter, which is fuel for plants and is going to allow for more water retention. So these soil microbes that are down there in the food web, they create these glues that help hold particles of soil together in micro aggregates or little clumps, basically, which are then bound together by fungi in bigger clumps or macro aggregates or just soil aggregates. And that creates pockets of air in the soil, as does the movement of little soil organisms, which is important for a lot of different reasons. One of them is that the kind of organisms we want in our soil thrive in a really oxygen-rich environment. The sort of microbial organisms that can cause problems to the plants that we're cultivating don't thrive in those conditions. So like disease-causing microbes, they don't love that really highly oxygenated environment. Another interesting thing is that when we create these pockets of air, or we allow soil life to create these pockets of air, and they have a healthy soil structure, when rain falls, it falls into these pockets of air, it creates a vacuum, which then pulls even more air into the soil. So kind of like in the Charles Eisenstein video we watched, once things start improving, it's kind of like a virtuous cycle of the ecosystem functioning in that symbiotic way, making it better as it continues going. Okay, let's talk a little more about the nuts and bolts of actually boosting your organic matter content. So one of the best things you can do is to add healthy live compost. So not all compost is created equally. I'm not going to spend much time talking about composting today. I'll definitely include some resources in the follow-up email on how to create healthy, some people call biodynamic compost that has, just like in soil, we want there to be a lot of organic activity happening in our compost. Creating it at home is one of the best ways to go. When you buy it in a store, you don't know how long ago things composted. How long have they been sitting in a bag, not getting aerated? Was it just out in the sun getting baked and dried out? With that said, there are certain indicators when you're buying compost. Words like biodynamic can be a good sign that that compost is going to do more for your soil than others. But yeah, the price point goes up for sure. So in addition to compost, which is adding organic matter, it increases water retention, it covers the soil, acts as a protective layer. A technique that we like to use in our model sites, and I often use in my garden at home, is chop and drop, which is pretty much what it sounds. It's a type of green mulch. So basically, when you're pruning plants, and this works really well for fruit trees, but for a lot of like perennials and even some annuals, it's fine to just chop and drop right in place. You prune and then you leave it on the soil as a covering. So by covering the soil, you're helping, again, retain moisture. It's providing food as organic matter for our microorganism friends to digest and turn into humus and then break down into forms that are accessible for the plants, and acts as that sort of protective blanket. As do cover cropping and mulching. Cover cropping is a topic of its own, especially for people who are managing large amounts of land. But the general thought there is using living mulch, basically covering your soil with living plants, because the more functioning roots you have in the landscape, the more exchange of organic matter and carbon there is. They're shading the soil, they're protecting it from rain that can compact the soil further, like we saw in that video. I won't go into too much detail about cover cropping, but some of the common ones are like fava beans and peas and vetch that can fix nitrogen, and then like crimson clover, which is another nitrogen fixer. Then you have things like barley and oats. And this is typically a practice you'll see done more on an agricultural setting than a home landscape. But I think it's useful to think of any of your plants as being a cover crop in addition to whatever other functions they serve. Like, they're beautiful, they are feeding carbon to the soil, they're providing habitat or food pollinators, but they're also covering the soil. And then the last is mulch. Mulch, very similar here, right? We're looking at water retention, protection of the soil, adding organic matter. So I mentioned protecting the soil a couple times. It's really important to keep soil covered and protected. So we know about this thriving ecosystem that's going on under our feet, that's helping our plants to thrive, that's helping potentially regulate flooding, drought, precipitation, and so on. By covering your soil with either living plants or mulch, and we recommend arbor mulch, which is basically just wood chips, even better if they've been partially composted. This is your most fire-wise option. All mulch is combustible, but there are better options than others. There's a study out of University of Nevada, Reno, that looked at the combustibility of different mulches. And with arbor mulch or wood chips, you had a lower rate of spread of flames, lower temperature above the flames, and shortest flames, so lowest height of flames. It's important to know, again, all mulch is flammable, just like all plants are flammable. And you don't want to use any kind of mulch like this from 0 to 5 feet out from your home or other structures. So a third option, as you can see here on the left, is rice straw, which is more of what we'll use with annuals rather than like perennials, woody shrubs, or trees. There are a lot of reasons. We're not focusing on that too much today, but if you do want to use straw in your gardens, like your vegetable garden, you want to get rice straw, and wherever you buy it, you want to ask and ensure that it's as close to weed seed free as possible. Because if you have hay rather than straw and you have a bunch of seed in there, you're going to have a lot of plants that you weren't intending to grow popping up. So covering soil is important. There are so many forces that can have a negative impact on that thriving ecosystem, right? Like it doesn't want to be disturbed. It doesn't want to get compacted. It wants to keep that air, those airy pockets. It doesn't want to get exposed to sunlight, which can dry it out, which then when winds come can erode it and blow all of that beautiful soil life that you've helped to grow off into the wind. Similarly with flooding, can carry away a lot of that rich, good material and that biology. And it doesn't want to get sort of churned up. So for that reason, you want to avoid activities like tilling whenever possible. And, tilling again is something that's more common in agriculture than like a home garden or landscape, but even digging the soil technically is disturbing it. So imagine if you had like a giant being took a shovel and like dug up half of Petaluma and dumped it on Cotati. Like there would be a lot of really unhappy organisms, to say the least. So remembering that healthy soil is like 25% oxygen. If you have really compacted soil, that's probably not the case. And there might not be a lot of biological activity happening. If you have really degraded soils, you might need to start by opening up the soil. And that could be mechanical tilling, but even better, you would use a tool called a broad fork. So if you're in an area with really degraded soil, maybe it's really clay heavy, whereas when you think of a sandy soil, you've got these big particles of sand and they're different shapes, and water and roots and organisms can move through it really well. If you look at clay under a microscope, I'm forgetting the word, but there's a word for the like little clay platelets. They basically stack on top of each other like plates, and it's really hard for things to penetrate. And that's why water doesn't infiltrate that soil well. So you may want to open it up with a broad fork, which is a tool, kind of looks like if you took two like wheelbarrow handles, had them parallel, and then at the bottom there's a bar with like similar to pitchfork tines. And you can put this into your soil and then jump on it and kind of gently rock back and forth. And so what that's doing is, this is, imagine the soil and the broad fork is going in. You're rocking back and forth, you're opening it up. And this is my little Star Trek soil here. You're allowing oxygen to get in, but you're not churning up that soil structure. You're not taking things that were really happy being, say, 6 inches under the soil surface and exposing them to the sun and disrupting these little communities of life. Like we talk about it as an ecosystem, but just like any ecosystem, there are smaller communities within it and they want to stay together. So if you have to do that, if you have to open up your soil, you want to do it just one time and then focus on practices that are going to build soil health from there, like adding compost and water, which will jumpstart that microbial activity. Like I had mentioned, the microbes, they create those glues, and that helps create porosity, or that sponginess, like the microbes and the other soil life moving around, makes room for air. Really going for redundancy here. Sorry if it's too repetitive, but that's how I learn best. Makes room for air, water, roots, and then mycorrhizal fungi, which is a term you may be familiar with, maybe not. It's gotten a lot more attention in the last decade. So it literally means fungus root, mycorrhizae. So they're these little white strands that you see in this soil aggregate here. If you've dug around in your garden, you may have seen this. You may even see it in mulch in a landscape. These are critically important to the health of your soil. And that's because there's this symbiotic, synergetic relationship between plants and soil. And that happens via or through these mycorrhizae. So they have this mutually beneficial relationship where the plants are feeding the mycorrhizae and the mycorrhizae are feeding the plants. So what do I mean by that? What do the plants have that they can give to these fungi that the fungi don't get elsewhere, and vice versa? Well, from one direction, it's when we think about plants photosynthesizing, we typically think of, sure, they're taking in carbon dioxide that organisms like humans breathe out, that we release when we burn things like wood or fossil fuels, or just when organic matter decomposes and that carbon oxidizes. So we know that the plants take that in and they create oxygen. But so the carbon from the carbon dioxide, what's happening to it? Well, plants will exude they'll turn that into carbohydrates and simple sugar compounds, and they exude some of that into the soil. Some of it goes to build their structures, right? Like when we look at a tree, you think, okay, what is that tree made out of? Sure, there are minerals in their water, but it's mostly carbon. But not all of the carbon goes to grow the plant. Some of it is almost like a currency that they're exchanging with these mycorrhizae. The mycorrhizae need that carbon and they can't access it in other forms. So they have this relationship with plants. So what do the plants get in return? The mycorrhizae can send out like 12,000 miles of hyphae or roots that is those little white strands that infiltrate like every area of the soil, and they gather in minerals and other nutrients that in that form are not accessible to plants. They internally transform these minerals and nutrients to make them what we call bioavailable to plants. So the plants give this liquid carbon. So we have the liquid carbon pathway. They're giving that liquidized carbon to the fungi, and the fungi are giving back minerals and nutrients that the plants need to grow and to thrive. The microbes are benefiting from all of this as the community just sort of thrives together. As this is happening, you're getting more sponginess in your soil, because if you think of like how a tree's roots will grow towards a water pipe, the mycorrhizae are doing the same thing. They want to be close to that plant root because they know that's a source of food. They're wiggling around, they're getting close to the root, they're extending all over the place. 12,000 miles worth of hyphae, that's half the circumference of the earth, right? If you got on a plane and flew directly west for 12,000 miles, you'd be on the complete other side of the planet, which is kind of mind-boggling to think about, but it's a fun fact anyway. And so this is happening, the plants are loosening the soil, there's more airflow, just that virtuous cycle continues of co-benefits and mutual benefit. So virtually all plants are capable of this exchange, but some plants are better at fulfilling that symbiotic role and other symbiotic roles with the soil life than others. And it's the native plants that really excel, because just as there are native plants, there are native soil organisms. So you have these native plants that have co-evolved alongside and in partnership and in competition with soil organisms and other plants over millennia, time immemorial. They've had an incomprehensible amount of practice and experience in these ecosystem roles. So they're going to be more efficient at interacting with the mycorrhizae. They're going to be more resistant to stressors like disease or pests, climate shocks, all kinds of things. And just like you would find in an unmanaged native ecosystem like a meadow or a forest, for maximum health, we really want a diversity of plants. Oh, wow, I'm not sure what's going on with my PowerPoint here. Sorry, y'all. Okay. Where was I? Let's see. We want a diversity of native plants is ideal. And this is true in really any kind of gardening that you're doing, whether they're native plants or not. You want to have different plants that excel at different things. We talked briefly about cover crops. I mentioned fava beans and maybe daikon radish. So like fava beans, for example, they fix nitrogen, which is something that your soil life and your plants need. They also send what we call a spike root down that helps break up soil in place of tilling. So plants have their sort of specific specialties, if you will, and by planting a diversity of native plants that have had this incomprehensible amount of time of living in community with each other, the odds of you having a balanced, healthy soil and a healthy garden really, really increase. So for those of us who live here in Sonoma County, I'm just going to go over, I think like 4 or 5 examples of some natives that we like to work with in our model sites and that I like to use in the gardens. All of these slides that I'm about to show came from a presentation we did in partnership with the City of Petaluma as well. A couple months ago, it was a garden office hours about plant selection. I'll send out the link to that recording as well in the follow-up email for anyone who's interested. There are quite a few other examples and many, many natives to work with, but this is just a small snapshot. So we'll start off with the sticky monkey flower, which is Mimulus aurantiacus. There's a few different colors you can get with the true native plant, and then there are like garden variety cultivars. The native is your best bet for a lot of reasons, one of which is that it has lower water requirements. You might have seen these out in the wild along the coast. They really thrive in that coastal environment, kind of on hillsides, well-draining soils, but they will tolerate most soils here in Sonoma County, in my experience. However, planting them away from the coast, you might situate them somewhere in your garden where they'll get a little more shade. Like many native plants, they're going to have all of these beneficial relationships with pollinators and other insects and other wildlife as well. Next, we have Ceanothus. So this is another that there are many, many types. This specific variety, and again, these slides are from a different presentation, but this is not a type of Ceanothus that is locally native. It's like horticultural variety, like cultivar from a variety of Ceanothus that's from a little further south down the coast. But there are lots of options you can choose to incorporate Ceanothus into your garden. This particular one, Yankee Point, is more of a ground cover, which is a great way to keep your soil covered, which is living ground cover plants. But there are also varieties that will grow as really large shrubs and some that are even taking more of a small tree form. Both varieties have these lovely light blue blossoms. There are also some white varieties. One of the things I love most about Ceanothus is that it is one of the first things blooming in winter. You might see blooms, I want to say February, at least in my own garden. It's almost always the first thing that comes into bloom, a really important early food source for pollinators. Corey knows a lot more about bees than I do, but I can tell when bees really love something, and I know that the bees really love the Ceanothus that are in my garden. It has a really nice fragrance. It also has a really high saponin content. So if you were to like rub the flowers between your hands, it has almost a soapy consistency. Next up, we have yarrow. We've probably all seen this one out and about. The straight Achillea millefolium is the native variety, white flowers, sometimes yellow. This plant has been cultivated to be many different sizes, many different colors, like salmons, oranges, deep reds. Any are a good choice. I like the native. It's really easy to grow from seed. It doesn't need much water once it's established. It's pretty drought resistant. This is another great one for pollinators. And keeping in mind, you know, I couldn't tell you too much about how each of these species interacts with the soil life, other than that they have a beneficial relationship due to that many thousands of years of trial and error and honing the skills. We have coyote mint, the Russian River variety. A lot of similarities here. Is pretty resistant to wildlife that might want to snack on your garden. So if you live in an area, maybe you're in a more rural part of Petaluma, for example, and you get a lot of deer, I'm not going to tell you the deer won't eat it, but they might be less interested in it than, say, a hydrangea or something that's not a native species. This is a good plant if you have maybe some shade in your yard from oaks. It doesn't want deep shade, but it'll tolerate half shade as long as it gets a few good hours of sunlight. There's a couple varieties that have slightly different flower shapes, but this is kind of the typical purple color. And just to touch on as we move on to our last plant slide, Dahliax has a lot of resources on native plants. There are a lot of really excellent local organizations that focus on native gardening. We'll send along a bunch of helpful links so that you're not just thinking about these 5. I just wanted to give a little sampling. So Douglas iris is another plant that you might see growing naturally along the coast. A place I have seen it very frequently is if you're familiar with the Russian Gulch Trail in Bodega Bay. If you're not familiar, I highly recommend checking it out, especially at low tide. Some great tide pooling there, but all along, you walk along sort of a creek drainage or a gulch, as you might guess, and quite a few Douglas iris, as well as many other beautiful native plants. So this one is a bulb, doesn't need a lot of water. Another one that will tolerate shade and even full shade. It might not flower quite as much if it's in full shade, but if you've got a part of your landscape that you haven't really had much success growing plants because of that shade, or you're designing for the first time and wondering what the heck to do with that shady corner of your garden, this is just one option that might work for you there. And as far as pollinators, this is a great flower specifically for moths and butterflies. So in Dahliax model site gardens, we're always focusing on boosting soil health, trying to increase soil organic matter as much as we can. We don't get to, manage our model sites as closely as we would love to, but we do our best, and we don't work exclusively with native plants. We try to kind of walk a best of both worlds approach of providing food as well as habitat and sequestering carbon and conserving water, especially. So while for here on the top left example, for example, is the Petaluma Library Garden. We are on the Payran side of the building, on the west side, and we have a number of fruit trees, plants that come from analogous climates like South Africa, Australia, Chile, or the Mediterranean, and then also a fair amount of native species. Again, trying to just create this ecosystem that has lots of sources of organic matter, that produces food and beauty for the community, habitat for wildlife. This picture on the top right is from, I believe, fire station number 3. I always forget the numbers, but this is the one on McDowell and Corona. We have quite a bit of, you see monkey flower in the background, and I'm pretty sure this is Margarita Bach variety of penstemon, and penstemon is another beautiful flowering native plant. These bottom 2 are from sites in Windsor, with yarrow, California poppies, and then you can see there's quite a bit going on in the zoomed out one. This time of year, there's more interesting things to see, I would say, in our Petaluma Library Garden, but if you happen to be in the northern end of the county, would definitely recommend checking out our food forest and native garden at Robbins Park, just if you're looking for some inspiration on what you can do with native plants. And if you go out there, I encourage you to move some mulch aside and check out the soil and see if it looks like the soil we've been talking about. And if it doesn't, let us know, because that means we need to adjust some things. Whatever your situation is where you live, if you're looking at improving your soil health, maybe you have a lawn right now and you want to have a garden that's going to be conserving water, all of the wonderful things we've been talking about, healthier soil, just encourage you to dream big. So this example, this is our executive director, Trathan's house in West Petaluma. And you can see on the left kind of an uninspired, mostly dead lawn, a few smaller shrubs or grasses, kind of hard to tell in this photo. And then on the right, you have this eco-friendly oasis that, though you can't see in this picture, I can tell you has very spongy soil. And again, Trathan's not working exclusively with natives, which some of you might be able to tell just from looking at this picture. He works with native plants, lots and lots of food producing plants. I want to say he has over 20 fruit trees in a pretty small amount of space. Lots of herbaceous perennials, just thinking of his landscape as an ecosystem, including the soil life. Thinking about how do we feed the soil in order to have a healthy, thriving garden. And so what you might do if your current situation is looking like the picture on the left, and whether you want it to look like the right or just encompass the same values as the right, a process that we recommend, and if you know Daily Acts, you've probably heard us talk about it before, or maybe been to one of our volunteer days, is called sheet mulching. And so this is a process to improve soil health rapidly that is basically just a weed barrier and then a whole bunch of organic matter on top. So we put out at least one layer of cardboard. You probably want to use, or you do want to use, either recycled cardboard, or if you're using cardboard you've collected yourself, you want to make sure that you've removed tape. You try to avoid glued cardboard or things with colored inks, because as we know, our soil is a living ecosystem. We don't want to introduce any chemicals that could harm those organisms. So we have a layer or more than one layer, depending on what your weed situation there is like, of cardboard, followed by an inch of compost, and then 2 inches of arbor mulch. And I say 2 inches because that is the fire safe recommendation from Fire Safe Marin. Previously, we were doing 3, even more inches of mulch just to really ensure there is a thick layer of protection for the soil to try to keep as much water in place. So depending on your context, you just need to make a decision that's best for you. But over time, you have the soil that's in place working with the compost and the mulch to break down that cardboard, compost in place. Now is a really good time of year to do sheet mulching, because as we hopefully continue to get significant rain, we'll be able to plant in the springtime, and you'll be planting in a much healthier soil than you would be without sheet mulching. I want to quickly mention that wherever you live, you should look into whether the city offers you a rebate for sheet mulching or some kind of incentive. Petaluma has one of the best programs, if not the best program that I know of, for a lawn transformation conversion called Mulch Madness. And I believe that ended in October, but it's something that's available to Petaluma Water customers every year. Cannot recommend it highly enough. You get all these materials to sheet mulch, as well as to convert a sprinkler system into a water efficient drip irrigation system, including the delivery of the mulching, compost, and cardboard, which can oftentimes be the most expensive part. Santa Rosa, Windsor, Cotati, I believe, all have the Cash for Grass program. Just really encourage you to look into those, and we can try to include some links in the follow-up email as well. All that's to say, maybe you don't currently live somewhere where you have much opportunity to improve soil health, but that doesn't mean your options are exhausted. You can help out in a community garden. You can volunteer with organizations like Daily X or any other sort of garden-oriented organizations around the county. You can take what you've learned here and maybe continue to learn afterward if you're feeling inspired, and educate the people in your sphere of influence so that they can implement those practices on their landscapes. And there's always the option of educating your elected officials about the importance of soil health and seeing what kind of solutions you can come up with collaboratively to see us implementing and growing healthy soil across the entire county. And I would just invite you to imagine how things could have potentially looked different when we had that really significant rainstorm just about 2 weeks ago now. We had flooding, and there's this risk of landslides and the burn scars that we've had. If we were growing healthy soil everywhere in the county, how much flooding might we have had? Just fun to think about. So a lot of information at once. There's kind of a reason, as I mentioned in the beginning, that most of the conversations about soil are really dense and detail oriented. This was our attempt to try to thread the needle between too high of a level and too much detail. So we will have time for question and answers. We'll answer what we can to the best of our availability. What we can't, we will look into and follow up with you after. But before we jump into that, I'm going to turn it back over to Corey for a couple quick closing slides.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Connor. That was really great. I know I probably speak for a lot that soil is really important, and you did a great job covering so much with a little bit of time. We did go over a few plants, but if that kind of tickled your interest and you feel really inspired and you want to take some of your creativity, we are going to be leading a follow-up workshop coming in November 18th. It's going to be on garden design, dreamscaping, and that will be, you can register online at upcoming events. We also have another live webinar with Brianna, and she'll be leading a webinar on reusing rain barrels and through doing a do-it-yourself rain barrel system. And that'll be taking place November 9th at 5:30 to 7 o'clock. This is really exciting as well because if you attend, you are able to potentially win a free rainwater harvesting system. And you can also register online at santarosacity.org/workshops.
We'll be sure to include those registration links in the follow-up email as well.
Yeah. And we just want to say thank you to all of our sponsors, which help to make our webinars possible so we can outreach to our community. There's other ways that you can get involved as well. But thank you so much. We appreciate you coming in, and we're excited to dive into some of your questions. There's a lot of really good ones that were being popping up.
Thank you, Corey. Okay, do you want to
yeah, Karen asked if pea gravel is a good mulch.
So pea gravel might be a good option in that 0 to 5 feet out from your house zone that I briefly mentioned, just for fire safety. But pea gravel is not going to have the same kind of benefits that an organic material like wood chips will. For one, you're not going to get the organic matter from the material breaking down because gravel is not going to decompose like wood chips or even rice straw or the leaves that fall on your garden, which is a great mulch. If you have like deciduous trees that drop leaves, that's great mulch because they are going to have a lot of the bacteria that you want. There are a few other reasons. It's going to retain a lot of heat, which will actually heat your soil more than you want during the summer, and it can dry it out. It could be kind of, it might even be a little heavy on top of your soil. I'm not sure about that one, but the short answer is it's not a great option other than in that zone just immediately beyond the walls of your home.
Awesome. Thanks, Connor. Karen also asked another follow-up question: is green moss on your soil a good thing?
Do you want to take that one, Corey?
Yeah, it's actually not moss, it's algae. And so it creates this film on top of your soil. So especially if you have like pot containers that can fill the surface, and it actually makes it so that the water can't permeate past that, and it can create the actual soil that has all your root systems for your plant not be able to obtain that water source. So if it's that kind of filmy, slimy green moss, if that's what you're referencing, I would just pick it off the top of your soil, unless you're just bringing up a mulch. But that is where my mind goes, is that the algae that surfaces, it can be almost like a lily pad color, or it can actually be that mossy little grass almost type of texture, but it's originating from an algae. So I would remove it so the water can seep down.
Awesome. Thanks, Corey.
Yeah.
I've got the Q&A pulled up now too. So I see a question from Summer. Curious to learn more about chop and drop. Are there plants we'd recommend not using this method with, such as oleander and conifers? Well, I would definitely say with regard to conifers, there are a few things to consider. I don't think it's, as is so often the case when we're talking about living systems, it depends. So, with your conifer, let's just say it's like a redwood or some kind of like a Italian stone pine, which are both really common here in Sonoma County. What I would be concerned about with including those just right into your garden is that they can decrease the pH of your soil if you do too much of it. So it'll make your soil more acidic, which is good for some plants, but that's something you'd want to be conscious with. And they're also really flammable. The flip side of that is, for right underneath those trees, it's probably really beneficial to let that material decompose sort of under the canopy of that tree as it would naturally in the forest. And as far as oleander, I don't know. My intuition would be that it would be okay. But if you, Corey, or if anyone in the audience knows otherwise, please feel free to say so. And beyond that, I don't know of any chop and drop plants I would avoid, other than plants that don't like pruning. And there are lots of good resources on like how to maintain specific plants. I would start there and think about what plants you have, and if you're already pruning them, it's probably safe to chop and drop.
The only other plant I can think of is euphorbias. When you cut them, there's like the white little film that bleeds from where you prune it. Those plants also are poisonous to animals, so you might not want to leave euphorbias or other like poisonous plants on the ground if you have children or animals.
And I see Terry Church in the chat just mentioned the same thing about oleander. So yeah, another thing to consider. Those are all the questions we have in the Q&A, but if folks have other things they're interested in or questions that are lingering, I'm kind of running through the soil here, or if the soil, running through, just read the word soil in the chat to see if there are any unanswered questions. Can you repeat the sheet mulching recipe? Absolutely. And I like that you use the word recipe because another name for sheet mulching is lasagna gardening, which I just really love. So you start with a layer of cardboard, and this is to block sunlight from reaching the soil in that place. So the idea is that it's going to prevent weed seeds from germinating there. Certainly not bulletproof, especially if you have stuff like Bermuda grass. But so cardboard, at least one layer, and then an inch of good quality compost, and then 2 inches, depending on your context, you might use more, but that's the best fire safe option, 2 inches of arbor mulch, like wood chips. And so when Daily Axe does installations, whether they're for municipal partners like Petaluma for our model sites, or at homeowners' gardens, we typically get all these materials from Grab and Grow, which is in Sebastopol or just southeast Sebastopol. All right. Judy wanted to know about minimizing slugs and snails, even using mulch in a veg garden. Yeah, it's a tough one. The slugs and snails love the carbon of the mulch, so it does kind of attract them. I'm wondering if, Corey, you have a good solution. My mind goes to ducks, but I know that's not an option for everyone because ducks love to eat slugs and snails.
Yeah, it's a great question. I've used chickens, so birds are pretty good. I am shy from using like salt or anything that can harm other good bugs that we want, like worms. Let's see if anyone. Net has a really good recommendations. Slugs love calcium poor soil, so add eggshells to your compost to drive them away. Nice.
Yeah.
Make sure when you are adding eggshells to have them dried out prior, because you don't want wet eggshells in your compost because of salmonella.
Yeah, thank you, Corey. That's a good point. And then another piece of advice that is kind of just a catch-all cop-out answer, but it's also true, is for all pests, is the more healthy your soil is, the more healthy your garden ecosystem will be. So you'll draw in more natural predators like birds who could fill the same function as chickens or the ducks. And I see Terry had another good suggestion. If you stack wood or rocks, that creates habitat for lizards who eat snails and slugs. And I'm glad you said that, because that's something that we do in my garden here in Forestville. We have our beds lined with, like, field stones, and there are just those little western fence lizards everywhere. And I haven't had many issues with snails and slugs, even on my lettuces. So that's a good idea, Terry. Any final questions? We technically we could still, we have time for them if you have questions. That's okay if not. Well, then I just want to take the last minute or two here to again express deep gratitude to you all for taking the time out of your Thursday evening to hang out with us and learn about soil. I know, especially, what are we, like 33 years into the pandemic now? Like, webinars, they're tough to show up for, so we really appreciate you being here and showing up with great questions and hanging through to the end. And again, big thank you to the City of Petaluma. We couldn't do it without you.
Thank you, everybody.
All right. Well. Oh. Thanks, Terry. Hopefully we have the seal of approval. It's a tough topic to talk about especially when in webinar format, where we can't see your faces and we don't know what everyone's experience is, what their prior knowledge is. And also I think it actually helps that neither of us is a soil scientist, because we're not trying to, push down all of this really heady knowledge and trying to go high level. It's like, well, we'll talk about it in frames that work for us, and hopefully that resonates with you all. All right. Well, I guess we can just say goodnight. Call it a few minutes early. Hope to see you all at another event soon. Thank you for being part of our community.